You can now take a hike in the water of beautiful Lake Tahoe. California state parks have developed Tahoe's first underwater trail. It's called the Emerald Bay State Park Maritime Heritage Trail, and it includes 4 different sites showcasing sunken historic boats.
There is a lake in the American West that has been called the jewel of the Sierra Nevada for as long as anyone can remember. Sitting at more than 6,000 feet above sea level along the border of California and Nevada, Lake Tahoe holds enough water to cover the entire state of California in roughly a foot of liquid. It is the largest alpine lake in North America, the second deepest lake in the United States, and for generations it has been celebrated as one of the last places on Earth where the water is so impossibly clear that you can see down through 70 feet of blue, as though you were looking through glass. 15 million people visit every year. They come for the skiing, the boating, the hiking, the casinos just across the Nevada line. They come because Lake Tahoe looks like something from another world. But when the water started dropping in 2024, what the divers began finding beneath that beautiful surface forced a very uncomfortable question. How well do we actually know what is hiding in the places we think we understand completely? Lake Tahoe did not start dropping overnight. The Sierra Nevada snowpack, which feeds the lake through dozens of streams and rivers, had been below average for several years running. Evaporation was outpacing inflow. Scientists who have tracked the lake's health since 1968 had already been watching its famous clarity decline, with 2024 measurements showing the lake was about 40 feet murkier than it had been in the late 1960s when monitoring began. But the falling water level was something different. When a lake as enormous and deep as Tahoe visibly pulls back from its shoreline, it is not a subtle change. Beaches that had been submerged for years slowly reappeared. Rocks that had not seen open air in a generation emerged from the water. And along with them came things that human beings had spent decades believing were safely out of sight and out of reach. The first reports came from people walking newly exposed stretches of shoreline. Tires, rusted metal, glass bottles with the kind of vintage shapes that placed them firmly in another era. Easy enough to dismiss as ordinary lakeside litter, the kind of careless debris that accumulates anywhere people gather to recreate. But the divers who went in after the water receded were not finding ordinary litter. They were finding something that had been sitting underwater long enough that the lake itself had begun to absorb it. Colin West, the founder and executive director of the nonprofit Clean Up the Lake, had spent years diving Tahoe's perimeter and described pulling out everything from car tires and engine blocks to a 6-foot lamppost, a metal statue, an engagement ring, and a barbecue. When he first began diving in Lake Tahoe, he was easily pulling out 50 to 100 pounds of litter per dive, which showed him immediately that the underwater litter problem was far larger than anyone had publicly acknowledged. The organization's 72-mile underwater circumnavigation of Lake Tahoe removed nearly 25,000 pounds of submerged litter from the lake, supported by volunteers, grant organizations, and community donors. That number sounds extraordinary until you sit with it for a moment. 25,000 pounds in one lake, a lake that is marketed to 15 million annual visitors as one of the most pristine bodies of water in the world. The gap between the image and the reality beneath the surface was already enormous before the drought made it worse. But the litter, as disturbing as it was in its sheer volume, was not the discovery that rattled people most. That came from something older, something that had been sitting on the bottom long before anyone thought to look. In 2012, diver and scientist Neil Jones and his crew discovered 8 miles of a decrepit telephone cable belonging to AT&T's PacBell subsidiary lying submerged beneath Lake Tahoe. The cable had been leaching toxic lead into the lake for decades, and despite many efforts and years of attention, it still had not been removed. Jones estimated the cable contained roughly 150,000 pounds of lead. 150,000 pounds of lead. Sitting in the drinking water of a lake that feeds downstream communities, that people fish in, that children swim in every summer. Not rumored, not folklore. Documented, confirmed, sitting there still. The cold of Lake Tahoe is central to everything that has been found in its depths. The lake's deepest point plunges to 1,645 feet. Below a few hundred feet, the water temperature hovers in the low 40s and essentially stays there year-round. There's almost no biological activity at those depths, almost no oxygen, almost nothing that would break down organic or inorganic material the way it breaks down in warmer, shallower water. The lake does not consume what sinks into it. It holds things. It preserves them. And the most striking demonstration of that preservation did not involve industrial debris at all. In 2011, divers recovered the body of Donald Christopher Windecker, who had disappeared while scuba diving 17 years earlier. His remains, still clad in a wetsuit, were remarkably well preserved at 265 feet. The cold, oxygen-poor water had done what no freezer could, held him in a state of near suspension for nearly 2 decades. That single discovery changed the way scientists and residents understood what the lake's chemistry actually means. If a human body could be preserved for 17 years at moderate depths, what might be preserved at 500 feet? At 1,000? At the maximum depths, where remotely operated vehicles operate? Those questions moved from theoretical to urgent as the drought of 2024 pushed researchers and divers into parts of the lake that had never been systematically surveyed. The ROVs that were deployed to examine deeper sections of the basin captured footage that researchers described as genuinely difficult to process. Not because of any single spectacular find, but because of the cumulative weight of what was down there, decade upon decade of human use, carelessness, and in some cases deliberate disposal, all of it sitting in cold storage, unchanged. The history of Lake Tahoe is inseparable from what the divers found. Before World War II, the lake was remote and largely wild. The roads connecting it to California's population centers were rough and often impassable in winter. A few lodges served wealthy tourists. The lake existed mostly on its own terms. Then the post-war boom arrived and changed everything almost overnight. The Nevada side of the lake was legal gambling territory. Casinos went up. Hotels followed. Summer cabins were converted to year-round homes. Resorts multiplied. The population of the basin grew faster than any infrastructure designed to manage its impacts. And the waste that came with all of that growth had to go somewhere. In the 1940s and 1950s, environmental regulation was either non-existent or too new and too underfunded to be enforced meaningfully. Pollutants from cars and roads poured into the basin. The earlier Comstock silver mining era had already stripped more than 60% of the trees from the surrounding slopes, destabilizing soil and altering runoff patterns in ways that still affect the lake today. The idea that Lake Tahoe was somehow immune to the pressures placed on it was always a myth. The water just hid the evidence well. The organized crime history of the Tahoe-Reno corridor adds another layer to the story. During the casino boom of the 1950s and 1960s, the region was disputed territory between criminal organizations operating out of Reno and Las Vegas. Local legend has long held that the lake contains victims of mob violence dumped in deep water where they would never be recovered, with the cold temperatures said to preserve them indefinitely. For decades, this was treated as colorful local folklore. But the new low-water surveys and deeper ROV explorations have renewed fears that more preserved tragedies may rest in the abyss, and urban legends of dozens of bodies, some whispered to be connected to organized crime, have been given fresh life by the latest discoveries. It is important to be precise here. Rumors are not evidence. Local legend is not documentation. But it is equally important to acknowledge that Lake Tahoe's known chemistry, the same chemistry that preserved Donald Windecker for 17 years, makes the legend at least physically plausible in a way it would not be in a warmer, shallower lake. What the 2024 surveys confirmed beyond any doubt was the ongoing and measurable decline in the lake's health. Lake Tahoe had one of its murkiest years on record in 2024, with a white measurement disk used to gauge clarity disappearing 62.3 feet from the surface, about 6 feet shallower than the previous year, and only 1.9 feet better than the worst record set in 2017. Scientists studying the lake said the 2024 levels fell about 16 feet short of California's clarity goals for 2031 and would require an improvement of 35 feet to return to historical levels by 2081. That is not a projection for the distant future. That is a measurement of where things stand right now, expressed in decades of necessary work. Lake Tahoe also holds the third highest concentration of microplastics among 38 freshwater lakes and reservoirs measured globally, according to research published in the journal Nature. And its algae blooms, which have been increasing as water temperatures rise due to climate change, can be toxic to people and their pets, with health officials posting warnings at popular swimming beaches, including El Dorado Beach on the South Shore. The lake that draws millions of visitors every year for its legendary clarity is simultaneously a lake with toxic algae warnings at its most popular swimming beaches. Both of those things are true at the same time. Researchers at the UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center continue to monitor the lake's water composition, clarity, and biological activity. The organization has directed public attention toward verified threats including aquatic invasive species and algal blooms, which represent real and ongoing dangers to the lake's ecosystem and the communities that depend on it. The work of sorting out what is verified from what is rumor matters enormously, because the verified threats are serious enough on their own. A lake with 150,000 pounds of lead cable on its floor, with measurable microplastic concentrations, with toxic algae appearing at swimming beaches, with decades of untracked underwater debris, does not need embellishment. The truth, confirmed and documented, is already a story that demands attention. What the falling water levels of 2024 ultimately revealed was not a single dramatic secret, but something more complicated and more lasting. They revealed the gap between the image of Lake Tahoe and the reality of Lake Tahoe. The image is the one in the brochures and the tourism advertisements and the social media photographs. A lake so clear it barely looks real, surrounded by granite peaks and pine forests, a place that exists outside the ordinary consequences of human activity. The reality is a lake that has absorbed 70 years of the region's growth, has been used as a disposal site for debris that people preferred not to look at, and is now showing the accumulated cost of that treatment in ways that can no longer be ignored. The drought that pulled back the water was temporary. Heavy winter storms in early 2026 sent billions of gallons back into the lake, raising levels and once again concealing parts of a lakebed that had been briefly exposed. The shoreline debris slipped back underwater. The newly visible beach disappeared again. But the knowledge that was gathered during that window does not disappear with the water. The dive logs exist. The scientific measurements exist. The footage from the ROV surveys exists. The record of what is sitting on that lake floor, the lead cable, the debris, the objects that will take generations to fully understand, is now part of the permanent record of what Lake Tahoe actually contains. The lake is still beautiful. That is not a consolation. It is a complication, because beautiful places are the ones we are most tempted to protect with mythology rather than honesty, to describe as pristine when what we mean is that the damage is not yet visible from the surface. Lake Tahoe is one of the most studied, most monitored, most regulated bodies of water in the United States. And even here the gap between the surface appearance and the underwater reality took decades to begin to close. If it can happen here, it can happen anywhere. The water drops, the divers go in, and what they find is not what the brochure promised. It never really was.